My Gavanen Melonin, and well met indeed. I'm Azaghal, and welcome to another lore cast. Today, delving into that most ancient of things, the relationship between dwarves and elves. Or in truth, this episode is entitled The History of Nogrod and Belegost, but that is intertwined with the elves and dwarves and their relations and interactions in the First Age. But before we begin, I must start as usual with special thanks to those who have supported the channel, and this month thanks go to a gentleman, or possibly a lady, or indeed X if that's what you prefer, Taz, who joins the ranks of Banner Marshals. Thank you very much to your ongoing support, and as ever a list of names of supporters will appear at the end. So let's dive straight in then. Nogrod and Belegost, two great dwarven mansions in the Blue Mountains that were founded at the very beginning of dwarven history with the awakening of their forefathers. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to dwarven history, the information is scant at best. And whilst we know, of course, Durin's name, we do not know the names of the other 6 fathers of the dwarves. So I can't give you those. But Nogrod on the map of the Blue Mountains is known to be slightly to the south of Mount Dolmed, on what would eventually become known as the Dwarf Road, a road that crosses over the mountains and then links Beleriand and Middle-earth. Belegost's location, however, is a little more uncertain. In Karen Wynne Fonstad's Atlas of Middle-earth, that many people will know and have seen maps of and is indeed on the screen at the moment, she places Belegost to the far south of Mount Dolmed, in what would then be the southern branch of the Blue Mountains in the Third Age. So after the fall of Beleriand, her location for Belegost would be on the southern spur of the Blue Mountains. By that I mean south of the Gulf of Lune. However, it is generally regarded and usually taken as canon that Belegost is in fact on the northern side of the Blue Mountains and only a very short distance away from Nogrod, with Belegost being slightly north of Mount Dolmed as opposed to Nogrod being slightly south. And there's 2 different maps have been on the screen while I've been speaking that will show those different locations and you can see them in more detail. So that's the location, but the one thing that we do know for absolute certain is that both of them are on the eastern slopes of Ered Luin, not the western slopes. And neither are they sort of bang in the middle. They are on the east. So most of their early interactions were eastward and unknown to us in the lands of Eriador, although it was called something else at that time, I imagine, but not to the west. Speaking first, though, of their names, Nogrod is, of course, Sindarin, as is Belegost. In their own tongue, they are known as Tumunzahar and Gabilgathol, respectively. So Tumunzahar is Nogrod, Gabilgathol is Belegost. And in Manish or Westron, Nogrod translates to Hollowbold, and Belegost is known as Mickelberg. No, it doesn't translate to Hollowbold, sorry, it is known as Hollowbold, and Belegost is Mickelberg. And all of their names, be them Western, be them Dwarven, or Kuzdal as it's known, or be them Sindarin, the name means, Nogrod means hollow dwelling, and Belegost means great fortress. So those are what their names actually mean. The founding of the cities, as I say, is unknown, but we know that the fathers of the Firebeards and the Broadbeams awoke in the Blue Mountains, and those are the 2 clans that populate the mountains. Work began on the city sometime thereafter, and no other dwarven holds are actually found in the Ered Luin. So these 2 are the only locations. They aren't like humans. They don't have big central cities and then little villages dotted around them. They just have one giant cavernous city. And of course it expands over time, and they delve new caverns and pathways and connections under the mountains. But they don't have little enclaves living, say, 10 miles further up the mountain or anything like that. It is also not known if the Firebeards and the Broadbeams took one city each, or if they totally mixed together, and at all times the peoples of Nogrod and Belegost were perhaps members of both clans. It just simply isn't known, so I can't give you a definitive answer on that. Now, the dwarves first came to the elves' knowledge shortly after the elves had established themselves in Beleriand, during a time known as the Chaining of Melkor. At that time, evil had been rather subdued in Beleriand, and there was a time of great bliss, because the Valar, of course, had come and captured Melkor and taken him back, and many of his creatures were leaderless and directionless. So a peace and bliss reigned over Beleriand, and this is when many of the realms of Beleriand were established. And of course, Melian sets up her girdle in this time, protecting the lands of Doriath. However, despite the harmony that prevailed in the land at the time, relations between elves and dwarves were cool from the very outset. And Tolkien uses the word cool, but we would say nowadays cold or frosty, or they weren't good friends. So from the very beginning, the elves and dwarves, when they first had their interactions, they didn't like each other. Now, they didn't absolutely hate each other, but they just simply hadn't taken to one another. The elves specifically saw the dwarven language as cumbrous and unlovely, meaning it's harsh to the ear or difficult to say, and just generally a language you wouldn't associate with romance and sort of that kind of take on languages. So the elves didn't really like their language, and they held that against them, which is a little unfair, really, isn't it? And very few elves ever actually learnt Khuzdul. They didn't really bother. However, the dwarves, who are famously protective of their own language, they taught it very seldom, and instead they preferred to learn other people's languages. So whilst they disliked the elves, they did learn their language, but mostly out of spite, because they didn't want the elves to learn their own language. So it's a bit of an odd relationship to begin with. However, despite the fact that they didn't really like each other, they did come together on great works during the First Age, and the two nations, particularly the elves of Doriath and of course the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, they became wealthy through trade with one another. But perhaps their most celebrated joint work of all is the famed elven city of Menegroth, or the Thousand Caves as it's also known. The dwarves from Belegost were approached by King Thingol on the advice of Melian, who knew that the peace would not last in Beleriand. She knew that whilst Melkor was chained up now and his creatures were subdued, that's not going to last forever. And so she counselled Thingol that they should create a great defensible dwelling. And so he came to the dwarves and asked for their assistance, and together the elf and dwarf fashioned this great city out of the living stone itself. The dwarves handled more of the general excavation and the sort of structural support, and the elves handled decoration. Menegroth is also quite famous for having only a single entry point, being a bridge across a sort of chasm leading up to its gate. And whilst there may be secret and hidden entry and exits that we are unaware of, there is one great main entrance which was also carved by the dwarves. But then the decoration was handled by the elves, particularly the carving. So whilst the dwarves may have made sure that the cavern didn't collapse on itself, the elves then tarted up the columns, for want of a better word, and created all the shapes and whatnot. And it said Menegroth feels very much like a forest underground. For payment, the dwarves were taught much that they wanted to know from Melian, who had of course resided for a time with Aule, the dwarves' father, their great creator. But also they were paid in riches, specifically pearls, which they were very, very rare and unusual to the dwarves, because the pearls were sent to Thingol from Círdan from the sea. Pearls are particularly wondrous to dwarves because the dwarves hate the sea. They didn't like to look upon it, and they were particularly afeard of its sound, or rather the other way around. They hated its sound, and they were particularly afeard to look at it, or they were scared to look at it. So the dwarves were really anti the sea, and it's very difficult to go pearl fishing when you're quite literally fearing for your life whilst you're doing it. So pearls are a real wonder to the dwarves, and they were paid partly in pearls and just general jewels and gold and things like that, but also they took payment from Melian, and she taught them much that they wanted to know. So they formed a relationship, and in time they even then came to form a relationship of the smithing of weaponry and armour. Because as Melian predicted, the peace of the North was not to last, and it would be troubled, particularly by the forces spreading from Angband in the north. And there's some reason, there's some that suggest that Sauron is possibly to blame for this. Because of course, whilst Melkor is chained in Aman, Sauron was free to roam and do whatever he wanted. And so there's suggestion he may have been stirring up the trouble, but in any event, regardless of the cause, the orcs began to trouble the realm of Beleriand before Melkor returned from Aman, before he broke free of his bonds and chains. Although he doesn't really break free, he's set free, and then he, of course, does a lot. That's for another video. But before Melkor comes back, the orcs begin troubling Beleriand, and so the elves and dwarves come together over the smithing of weaponry and armour. Thingol came to the dwarves of Belegost once again, and they crafted many fine weapons, and particularly something they're specially known for is the crafting of chainmail. Dwarven chainmail is second to none, and is pretty much the pinnacle, although this sparks a massive debate. But there's massive suggestion to say that chainmail was the height of defensive technology at that time, and in fact plate armor was something that didn't exist. But then there's a line that we know attributed to, I believe it's Prince Imrahil, where someone breathes onto his plate vambrace. It's all a discussion for another time. But it's suggested that the dwarven chainmail may well be the finest armour in Middle-earth, save for like dragon scales, but they're rather hard to come by. It is said that none, not even the Noldor, had a greater knowledge of the working of steel than the dwarves, and of them, the most famous dwarven weaponsmith was Telchar. And he created many of the named swords that we know in the Third Age. He was based in Nogrod, and Nogrod was the greater of the two cities as regards smithing, weapons, and armour. And dwarven weapons and armour were said to be of such fine quality that the metal never rusted, and it shone forever as if new burnished, is the words Tolkien uses. So dwarven weapons and armour, as we are in a fantasy realm, it's allowed to have a touch of fantasy, and they are essentially 100% quality for their entire existence. They never rust or weather. The dwarves also take a little from the elves as well at this time, and chief amongst the things they take is their written word, because the Cirth runes, which then famously became attributed to the dwarves by the time of the Third Age, were actually the invention of an elf named Daeron. And the dwarves take his runes because they like them quite a lot. They prefer them to the flowing script that then will soon follow when Feanor and the Noldor arrive. But Daeron's script is taken by the dwarves and made into their own, and Cirth runes, as we know them today, are very much attributed to the dwarves, but they did come from an elf's hand. As we have already touched upon, Melkor eventually returns to Beleriand, and when he first comes back, the dwarves go into almost hibernation. They cease all traffic on the Dwarven Road, and all trade between the dwarves and elves comes to a halt. And of course, with Melkor returning to Beleriand, hot on his heels is Feanor and the Noldor, because they, of course, have cursed him, and they are pursuing him till their very death for the Silmarils that he has taken. Before the dwarves fully withdraw, though, so upon hearing the news of Melkor, they are troubled, but they don't fully withdraw just yet because they have enough time to have some dealings with the Noldor, who they actually prefer to the Sindar and the Green Elves of Assyrian. The Noldor, of course, are smiths. They are renowned smiths, and they took much of their teaching from Aule himself. And so the dwarves have a sort of special bond with the Noldor, if truth be told, because they both share this love of creation, and of course they both have a direct link to the father of the dwarves, Aule. Despite, however, preferring the Noldor, again twisting and turning with these people's relations, the dwarves actually had very little love for Caranthir and his people. So Caranthir is one of the sons of Feanor who took up residence on the western slopes of Ered Luin. So he was the closest elven realm, or his people were the closest elven gathering is probably the best word, that lived nearest to the dwarves, and they were on the western side of Ered Luin. Caranthir looked down on the dwarves with utter scorn. He gave them very little time. He thought nothing of them, if truth be told. The dwarves, of course, were fiercely secretive and very quick to judge and harbour resentment, and they weren't too keen on having a band of elves living almost on top of their very cities, potentially learning some of their secrets. And they also picked up, of course, that the elves, the Noldor under Caranthir, looked down on them, and so they in turn grew haughty and looked down equally on the Noldor themselves. So this distrust and dislike of each other is always bubbling under the surface, although nothing as yet has truly triggered this hatred. The mere existence of the two peoples is cause for hatred enough at the moment. However, Despite disliking each other, the dwarves and the Noldor hated Melkor all the more, and an alliance was struck. And in time, the dwarves do venture back out again, and trade is renewed on the Dwarf Road, with the cities of Nogrod and Belegost flourishing, and Caranthir also growing richer, because of course everything that passes to the dwarves now passes through Caranthir's direct realm. What starts as just a relationship boosting trade between the two peoples eventually grows to military assistance, and the dwarves pledge their allegiance and support, well, not their allegiance, but their support to Maedhros in his defense against Morgoth. So Maedhros, of course, is arguably the chief son of Feanor after Feanor's passing, and he very much coordinates the resistance of the free peoples in Beleriand against Morgoth. And the dwarves are most famously present in the 5th Battle of Beleriand, the Nernaeth Arnoediad. They're led to the field in this great battle by the king of Belegost himself, Azaghal. Now, Azaghal is renowned in the stories for 2 things. Number 1, which we're about to find out, because his prowess in the battle. And number 2, for being the only named king or lord of the Blue Mountains throughout their entire history until Thorin sets up in the Blue Mountains some 6,000 or at this point sort of 8,000 years later. So we have all of this. Well, we don't have that much history of Nogrod and Belegost, but we've got all of this that we're discussing, and at no point have we ever had a name for anyone from these places, particularly their leaders. But Azaghal at the Battle of the Nernaeth Arnoediad is the first to take a name, and that word is such a blooming mouthful. The dwarves win excellent renown, or are held in high esteem in the battle, because of course, the Nernaeth Arnoediad is a disastrous defeat for the Free Peoples, and at the end of the battle, the very field they are fighting on is engulfed in flame as Melkor unleashes everything he has from the pits of his home against the Free Peoples, and chief amongst these monstrosities is Glaurung the Dragon and all of his lesser drakes, and they absolutely swamp the field in fire. But the dwarves, being hardy and accustomed to the heat and the flames, are able to fight on despite this great heat. And as Glaurung marches out into the battle at the head of this column of just monsters and abominations, Azaghal and his dwarves stand firm, and Azaghal is even able to wound Glaurung during the battle. Unfortunately, his wounding of the dragon is his ending, because Glaurung then crushes him, but immediately flees the field, and all of his lesser drakes flee with him. The dwarves also march to war in great fearsome masks that they wore in this battle, and it's where we learn about the masks the dwarves wear. And it's said that the dwarven masks cast fear on all who looked upon them, and not just on the lesser orcs and the more mortal-like creatures of Morgoth's army, but also the dragons and the drakes were said to be quite afeared of the masks the dwarves wear. And so the dwarves were just known for this battle. Where all else was lost, the dwarves were held high. And as Azaghal fell, the dwarves then hold the rear guard of the East Field as the Noldor and the Sons of Feanor all flee the field and head back to Mount Dolmed. And the dwarves hold at the end there, so they allow the elves to flee the field, knowing that the battle has gone ill. But of course Azaghal dies, and shortly after his death, the dwarves around him begin singing in a low dirge, and a great funeral procession is formed in the midst of battle. The dwarves lift Azaghal's body high into the air, and they march him off the field, unchecked by the enemy. The enemy are so in awe of the dwarves and the actions that they've taken here that no one troubles the funeral procession as it leaves the field. And the eastern side of the Battle of the Nernaeth Arnoediad kind of ends in a song almost. Obviously a very depressing and emotional song for the dwarves as their king has fallen. But rather than ending with one side fleeing the field and being hacked down as they go, it ends almost with the two sides nodding at each other and walking their separate ways, which I think is quite interesting. So the enemy dare not interfere, and the dwarves take their dead king all the way back to the mountains, singing as they go. But when looking at the history of Nogrod, Belegost, Beleriand all the Greater, and indeed the animosity between elf and dwarf, everything takes the turn for the worst when the Nauglamir is brought to Menegroth by Húrin, some years after the 5th Battle of Beleriand. So the Nauglamir was a very famous necklace, and it was made for Finrod Felagund, who of course famously fought Melkor in 1-to-1 combat and died. The Nauglamir was made for Finrod by the dwarves, and at the time of its creation, it was near unmatched in beauty. The only thing, unbeknownst to the dwarves, that actually surpassed the beauty of the Nauglamir were the Silmaril themselves, or Silmarils. I've seen Silmarilli as well. I should actually just look the answer up on the plural of Silmaril, but there we are. But of course, Finrod died, and the Nauglamir was claimed by Glaurung after the fall of Nargothrond, which was the other great elven cavern city. And Glaurung maintained it in his hoard, but Húrin was able to take the Nauglamir and fled back to Menegroth with it, where he presented it to King Thingol. Now, King Thingol at this time also had possession of a Silmaril, for that was what was required of Beren in order to wed Luthien. He must retrieve a Silmaril, and he did. And he gave it to King Thingol, and so Thingol then set about mounting the Silmaril into the Nauglamir to create the very finest piece of jewellery the world has ever seen. Now, such a task would require the greatest smiths, and for this the dwarves were commissioned, and they did so willingly. So a party of dwarves was already in Menegroth, and they happily accepted the task. However, the Silmaril is undescribable in its beauty and its captivating power. And as the dwarves work tirelessly to mount it in this great necklace, they become enamoured of its beauty. And at the end, when the work was done, they demand the completed necklace as payment for their work. They say that the elves no longer have any right to own the Nauglamir because it was a gift for Finrod, and Finrod was dead. They also go so far as to say that Húrin actually stole the Nauglamir, but how one can steal an item from a dragon who stole it in the first place is rather hard to say. So, but that is the line that they take. Thingol declines on the spot. They're surrounded by this company of dwarven smiths, and in their blinded by anger and greed, the dwarves murder Thingol. For Thingol is alone in the chamber with them, and they jump him, basically. Using only what weapons they can have to hand, they slay Thingol there on the floor before them, and they flee the city with the now Silmaril entombed Nauglamir, or rather, Silmaril merged, fused Nauglamir. They, of course, then leave the city, and they head back to Ered Luin. But word quickly spreads that the dwarves have killed King Thingol, and they are hunted all the way back to the Blue Mountains, and only 2 of their company survive. But when they return to Nogrod and Belegost, they spin a tale of lies. And it's unfair to use Belegost's name here, because actually they flee to Nogrod, and that is where they tell their tale. And they say that the dwarves were betrayed by the elves and slain in cold blood, and not, in fact, that the dwarves were trying to claim payment much greater than what was owed. The city of Nogrod sits in quiet anger during this time, a short while after they hear this story, and they wonder what should be done about this apparent betrayal. But after a while they resolve to march on the elves themselves, and a battle-ready army of fully equipped dwarves marches for Menegroth. Now the Nogrodians, the dwarves of Nogrod, come to Belegost and ask for support in retribution for the death and slaying of the smiths who very willingly worked on this great jewel. And Belegost says no, and not only does Belegost not offer support, they try to persuade them not to attack. They tell them they shouldn't go on this warpath, but Nogrod ignores them, and led by their king, nameless though he is, they march on the city of Menegroth, and many elves and dwarves are slain in the ensuing battle, but utter ruin is brought to the great city of Menegroth. The dwarves, despite their losses, are successful, and the city is sacked. However, the dwarves of Nogrod do not make it back to the mountains, because Beren has heard of the great deeds, or, well, evil but great deeds of the dwarves, and he and his son Dior lead an army of green elves up from the Seven River region of Ossiriand, and they ambush the dwarves at a place called Sarn Athrad. It's a river crossing just outside of the Blue Mountains. And so the dwarves, having won in Menegroth and escaping with their plunder, they are ambushed on the crossing. Some dwarves do manage to escape the ambush, but then the Ents themselves, created at the very beginning to counter the dwarves by Yavanna, then fulfill their apparent creation by killing the dwarves that escape the initial ambush. Not one single dwarf returns to Ered Luin after the sacking of Menegroth. And, to add insult to injury, Beren himself kills the Lord of Nogrod and claims the Nauglamir and the Silmaril within it from the dead hands of the Dwarven Lord. It's also uncertain whether or not the Lords of Nogrod and Belegost were known as kings or whether they were known as lords. Lord is used quite a few times, but we always think of King Durin. So I don't know if they do take the title king, and I think it's probably rather interchangeable to be lord or king. But now relations between the elves and dwarves are soured indefinitely. And despite a passing of near 6,000 years until the end of the Third Age, we still see the animosity between them with Gimli's interactions with Legolas and the wider elven and dwarven interactions of the Third Age. And it all stems from chiefly the fact that they just don't like each other. They are distrustful of each other almost inherently. Something about their very creation puts them against one another. And 2, the fact that the dwarves see it as being betrayed by the elves, although it's a tale of lies. It's very difficult to be on the side of the dwarves when you read the story of the sacking of Menegroth. They claim a jewel which is, if we were to put a price to it, hundreds of millions times more what they were actually owed for the work they did. It would be like building a fence for your neighbour and then paying you £10 million for it. It's just utterly excessive. And then when the elves quite rightly say no, the dwarves slay the king who makes that decision, make off with the jewel that they've just created themselves, and then when the survivors make it back to the mountains, not only do they actually say, oh, we tried to take, we took this item, and it's massively more expensive than we needed to actually be paid. Not only do they not say that, they go even a step further and say we've been betrayed by the elves. They weren't going to pay us anything. They wanted free, cheap labour, so we took back what was rightfully ours. And then, of course, the dwarves then lead the war. They attack Menegroth themselves. They slay many more elves, and they destroy one of the chief havens of peace and harmony in Beleriand in the First Age. I like the dwarves, but it's all their fault. And so from this time henceforth, the dwarves never forget the war with the elves, or the betrayal as they see it. And of course the elves never forget the utter slaughter at the hands of the dwarves. And the two peoples hold a bitter resentment toward one another until the very end of days. And whilst we know that Gimli and Legolas are able to get over the hatred their peoples have, on a bigger scale, it is never ever suggested the dwarves and elves get over their hatred of one another. And of course, the elves all bugger off back to Valinor by the end of the Third Age, and the dwarves all disappear into the very depths of the earth, so it doesn't really matter. But it's a little disappointing to know that they never got over their differences. And that concludes our history of Nogrod and Belegost, because of course shortly after the sacking of Menegroth and the slaying of the Lord of Nogrod, Beleriand itself is plunged beneath the sea, and the two great cities are ruptured and ruined. There's some suggestion that some dwarves do continue to live in the mountains after the fall of Beleriand, because of course Ered Luin is not sunk beneath the sea, and it remains. But Nogrod and Belegost are ruined, and of course Thorin and his company return to the Ered Luin after Smaug claims Erebor, and they wander for a time, but then they go to Ered Luin as well. And it's so, we don't know if Nogrod and Belegost are ever actually lived in again, or if they are totally uninhabitable after the fall of Beleriand. We just simply don't know. But they fully pass out of the histories. And indeed, even when Thorin and his company and his people live in the Blue Mountains, no mention is ever given of Nogrod nor Belegost. So it is very easy to surmise that they are destroyed beyond habitation. And that ends the episode. So thank you very much for listening and following along. I've already explained that many of the older lore videos have now been taken down from the channel, or rather I've unlisted them. I've done that for my own peace of mind. If you wish for more information on that, I talk about it almost exclusively in the 14th episode of the High Elves campaign on the channel, which was posted on the 1st of December 2019, if you're looking for it and you're watching this in 2 years or something. But I do hope to revive, I will continue with the lore videos, absolutely, and I may cover some of the topics that I have done in the past. But for now, it just remains for me to thank those who continue to support the channel and support me directly. Your help, your support, your words of praise and encouragement are very, very welcome, and they do not fall on deaf ears, I should say. But for now, and until we speak again, dear friends, Nevair Neden Perimad Melonin, and farewell.